Welcome everybody at the Department of Economics. It's a pleasure to be here today with Jesús Fernández-Villaverde from UPenn, who will have a very interesting talk about geopolitics, geoeconomics, and the politics of it as well. And let me tell you, before I introduce the speaker, about this event, what we will do. We will have the talk by Jesús, and then we will have a discussion. I will moderate it with Tony Venables, and then there will be questions from the floor, both on site, but also online. So for the chaps online, there is a chat box. You can ask any question whenever you feel it's appropriate. And then at the end, we will answer some of the questions. We will take a sample and we will ask to both Jesús and Tony to discuss it. Before we get started on the topic, let me introduce the two speakers. One is Jesús Fernández-Villaverde from Penn. He's a very accomplished professor in macro and econometrics. And he has a very long history with Oxford because he came here the first time in 2016 as the Astor Fellow, who is a fellow that is an interdisciplinary position where the fellow must cover different subjects. And I think that is one of the striking features of Jesús, that is really multidisciplinary. And I think we will see this in the talk. Also, I started knowing Jesús in 2010, maybe 2010, when I was with the Bank of England before moving to Oxford. And what really struck me is his ability to mix topics. So he can do papers that they use a very sophisticated technical tools mixed with history, politics, and philosophy. And I think probably in the talk today, we will unveil some of the merits of this. So thank you for being with us, Jesús. And then we will have also Tony Venables, who is now an emeritus professor in Oxford, but he had a long career at the LSE in Oxford, was a statutory professor, and is an expert in trade, spatial economics, and geopolitics. So let me now welcome Jesús and pass him the baton for this, and then we will discuss. Thank you.
Thanks very much for having me here, and thanks everyone who is online. I, as always, have prepared way too many slides. I could probably talk for hours and hours, if not days and days, about geoeconomics. The slides are on my webpage. So if you just put my name on Google, I promise I'm the first hit, and then you click on research, and on research on my webpage, the slides are online. I invite everyone to download them, and I also invite everyone to send me feedback and comments. This is the kernel of a course I'm designing on geoeconomics, so any feedback is more than welcome. Okay, so geoeconomics is back. So what the heck is this about geoeconomics? So let me start with a very simple and straightforward motivation. Italy, in early 1915, is in a difficult position. Italy was actually, before the war starts in August 1914, a theoretical ally of the Empire of Germany and the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And yet, Italy doesn't join the war on their side. The official excuse is that the Triple Alliance was a defensive arrangement and that Austria-Hungary had started the war by invading Serbia. The real reason, of course, was that Austria-Hungary and Italy had long-standing disputes over some territory in what is today north of Italy and Yugoslavia. In fact, the historical leader of Italian liberalism, Giovanni Giolitti, and the parliamentary majority were against entering into the war. Most Italians thought, what do we have to do in this war? What do we have to win out of it? Now, it turns out to be the case that the British government has a different view. The British government feels that Italy entering into the war is going to create a new front in the south of Austria, and that's going to help relieve the situation in the West Front. And surprisingly enough, the United Kingdom is going to be able to convince Italy to get into the war with the Treaty of London in April 26, 1915, and Antonio Salandra, who was the prime minister, he was the leader of the Conservatives, actually agrees with this. So how does the British government induce Italy to get into the war? And even after very many long years of war where the Italian armed forces do particularly bad, like the disaster at Caporetto, convince Italy to stay into the war. Well, it's going to do it with a combination of carrots. Basically, Italy is going to be promised a lot of new lands, but also sticks. And the sticks, I'm going to show them in just 1 second. This is the imports of coal by Italy. Italy is an economy that in 1914 doesn't have any important source of energy that is domestically produced. And remember, even if this is hard to believe right now, in 1914, the United Kingdom is an energy superpower. It's one of the largest producers of coal in the world. And you can see that the Italian economy is importing around 1 million tons a month, sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less, depending on the season. And what you can see is over here, starting in August 1914, the imports start going down around 200, 150,000 tons a month. Why is this? This is not a problem like you are going to have later in 1917, where a lot of the merchant navy has been sunk by German submarines. This is the British government telling oil exporters, why don't you find an unexpected delay in that shipment of coal to Italy? And every time the Italians are playing hardball in the negotiations, we are going to find another delay in that export. What is Italy doing using this coal for? Well, the main industry at the time in Italy is textile. And the textile economy or the textile industry uses cotton from the United States. And what you can see very, very clearly over here, 1914, you see what happens with the imports from cotton? They go from 280,000 tons to only 48 tons. Why does this happen? This cotton comes from the United States. So the United States is not involved at the war at that moment. Well, it turns out to be the case that the cotton, despite coming from the United States to Italy, is being traded through the city in London. And it's being traded through Banca Commerciale and Credito Italiano that are using the London's acceptance market for paper money. And the Bank of England calls all the banks and houses in the city and tells them, why don't you accept paper from Credito Italiano anymore until Italy enters into the war? And what you see over here is that as soon as Italy enters into the war, the paper by the two banks in London starts to be accepted again. So basically, what the British government has done is use its economic power, its control over the cotton and the coal imports of Italy to force Italy or to coerce Italy into changing its behavior. If you want to read a little bit more about it, the classic description is by Douglas Forsyth, The Crisis of Liberal Italy, and more in general, how the British government used a whole array of strategies during the war. Nicholas Lambert has a beautiful book, Planning Armageddon. By the way, the British government also used all sorts of different instruments, even for instance, their control of the telegraph industry in the world to get a lot of pressure in other countries. It's somehow surprising that economists have not spent a lot of time thinking about this, thinking about this interaction between the politics and the economics. This is actually something that our colleagues in history, international relations, and international political economy have paid us interest, but perhaps there is still some additional work to be made. These are just not the only examples one can think about it. For instance, the US used its control over the international oil market around 1939, 1940 to put a lot of pressure on Japan. And it really pushed Japan to the brink. Of course, Japan was not behaving. They have invaded China, and that's the reason the US was imposing on them. And we also have, for instance,
analyze the FT article about how our investments
really nice, called The Economic Weapon, that shows how, for instance, during the 1920s, the proponents and the defendants of the League of Nations really thought that sanctions, economic sanctions, could be the tool of modern war. Okay? So then is how we are going to have what I want to talk about today. which is geoeconomics. So geoeconomics is the use of the standard tools that we have in economic theory and the standard tools that we have in econometrics to understand how countries exert power on third parties, like other countries, to achieve their political goals. So what do I have in mind? I want to understand how the British government used its whole range of power to induce Italy to enter and stay in World War I. I want to think about how the US, after World War II, uses power to change the economic decisions, its economic power to change the political decisions of many other countries. We can think about also from the perspective of the small countries. I'm a small country and I'm worried that an hegemon may impose obligations of me. How do I design my economic policy in such a way that protects me against that? We can think also about the trade-offs there between national security and integration. So we know, and believe me, I'm going to talk about that in a second, I'm not against Ricardian comparative advantage. I'm not against Hesch-Kerolin model of relative factor endowment. I took my prelim in international trade, okay, my qualifying exam, and I passed it. But the problem is, if I specialize in producing good A and I buy good B from a third country, it is very different buying good B from Switzerland, a set of nice chaps that do not bother anyone for the last 800 years, and that I can reliably buy it from them, than if I'm buying from Russia. Okay? And this type of factors and considerations have not been up and front in a lot of the discussion in international economics. So in that sense, this is very related with international economics, but the focus is different. I want to emphasize, these are not substitutes. Okay, I still teach standard international trade theory. I still teach Ricardian comparative advantage. And yes, there are deep insights in Ricardian competitive advantage. The problem is, do I really want to engage in trade with a country that can use that trade relationship against me down the future? Or I can think about, for instance, the type of national security externalities that are involved in this type of situations. Do I really want to import all my energy from a third country? Or do I want to develop a little bit of my own energy? And I'm not saying you should do one or the other. What I'm saying is economics has a lot to say about this, has a lot to bring to the table in terms of insights, and I think also in terms of the tools that we can bring. It has very strong links with economic history, for instance, with the economic history of wars. A couple of books that I always recommend my students to read because they are so interesting are these two books by Alan Bollard, Economies at War and Economies in the Cold War, that really highlights how economists play a very important role in designing the economic strategy, both of World War II and the Cold War, at least in the perspective of the Allied side. And a book that changed a lot of my views about World War II is by Phillips O'Brien, How the War Was Won. Okay, so there is a lot of relation with this type of ideas. They are complements, they are not substitutes. I love economic history myself. I don't want to imply that there is not any type of contradiction between the two. Of course, geoeconomics has a positive aspect to it, just trying to understand when do countries exert power, and it has a normative aspect to it. When should we exert power? And before you get a little bit nervous, I was talking with my dean about this, and when I say, when do we want to exert power, he got like, oh, you know, that sounds so bad. I said, no, you can exert power for good things. You can exert power to prevent countries to go to war. You can exert powers to get countries to settle down conflicts in a peaceful way. So power in itself is neither good nor bad, it's how you use it. And that's what sometimes is called economic statecraft. Very, very quickly, a brief history of the field. Some of you may say, wow, I haven't really heard much about the economics. What has happened with this field? Well, it actually has a very long pedigree, if I may say it in that way, in the history of economic thought. And I know this is one of those statements that if you say it in public, you risk losing your PhD degree, that, you know, my former department chair will send me an email and say you are not any longer a PhD in economics. But I think there was a little bit of that in in mercantilism. Okay, of course we know, David Hume, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, that mercantilists got a lot of things wrong. I think that mercantilists understood that trade also involves power in ways that are non-trivial and in ways that may justify departures from free trade, or at least thinking about those possible departures. But of course, there was never much of that work in the classical or neoclassical economies. If I had a little bit more time, I had a longer version of this history of economic thought slide where I get into some of the nuances of that statement. But really, the people who created modern geoeconomics were two German guys. Oh, I don't have the slide over here. I have it in the longer version. Wilhelm Röpke and Arthur Dix. In fact, the person who coined the term geoeconomics was Wilhelm Röpke. He was kind of a classical liberal, democratic guy. Arthur Dix was more on the other side. They actually had a lot of fights, but there was a lot of work done on geoeconomics in Germany and in the German-speaking world during the 1920s. Most of that work was not translated into English, which meant it kind of was a little bit forgotten. And basically what happens is that after World War II, in particular, because a lot of that work by these guys were linked with people like Rudolf Tschegelen or Karl Haushofer. I don't know if you know much about these guys, but they were a little bit of the ideologues of German expansionism and German nationalism that got a little bit tainted, and that type of thinking kind of disappeared from the mainstream. There was, however, an economist who came in from Germany, moved to the United States, through a very interesting life, and actually brought about this. And it's, of course, Albert Hirschman. By the way, if you can get your hands on a biography of Albert Hirschman, read it. Fascinating story. He's one of the few economists that has a Netflix series. It's called Transatlantic. Really fascinating. And Albert Hirschman, this guy wrote two very important books. National Power and the Structure of Foreign Trade, where he made the point and he documented very carefully how Germany had used the structure of international trade during the 50 years before World War II to achieve its economic goals. And then a book that maybe some of you come from development are familiar with, the Strategy of Economic Development. This is 1956, I believe. And in that book, it's slightly different, the reading I'm having. So usually the way this is taught in economic development or economic history is that he highlights backward and forward linkages. The idea is I want to build a car manufacturing industry. Well, I need steel. That's the backward linkage. But then I also need a network of gas stations. That's the forward linkage. What Hirschman mentions quickly in the book, but he doesn't develop too much, I mean, if he had it, is that understanding these forward and backward linkages was also key in terms of geoeconomics, because that's exactly what I want to impose my pressure on another country to get them to do what I want. That's what the British government understood about Italy. They need coal and they need cotton. That's the 2 points that I'm going to put pressure on. In fact, many of you, now I'm going to jump from development economics into industrial organization. You probably have heard about the Hirschman index of market concentration. Well, Hirschman developed it for an index of geopolitical power, and then it kind of jumped into industrial organization. Kind of an interesting little thing. Anyway, but the point is, we didn't really do much about geoeconomics except Hirschman during the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. People, as I was mentioning before, in international relations and international political economy talk a lot about it, but didn't have much impact in economics. Why now? Well, I will say 4 points. Point number 1 is the rise of China and the return of great power competition. For the first time in many decades, we are again in a situation where there are at least 2 potential hegemons in the world, the United States and China, and as in the case during World War II, that one of those hegemons has a very different view about how international relations should be organized. Second, we have seen a renewed increase in the use of sanctions. We have seen in particular sanctions against Iran, against Venezuela, and against Russia playing a very important role in the political world landscape. And we have seen a very fast increase in economic fragmentation. So this is a graph that summarizes one of my recent papers on geoeconomics. It's called Are We Fragmented Yet? And what we do over there, I do this with Tomo at the IMF and with Don Honso at Johns Hopkins University, is we estimate a dynamic factor model, and don't worry too much about what that means, but it's kind of a way to put together a lot of different information and get an underlying factor of how the world economy is integrated or disintegrating. And what you can see very clearly is that the world economy was integrating over here during the 1990s. Those are the years where everyone is talking about globalization and how we are becoming one flat world. And then around 2007, it started disintegrating. And it started disintegrating during the financial crisis. Then it kind of stopped a little bit. And again, over the last few years, it's disintegrating very fast. Okay? So we are in a whole new different world. And I can tell. And you know why I can tell? Used to be the case that in 2016 or 2014, when I first came here to Oxford, my wife and I will just go through immigrations without any problem. Turns out to be the case that my wife realized 1 week ago that now she needs an ETA to come to the United Kingdom. And she has a US passport. It's not that she's coming from some type of strange country. Okay? It's harder now to travel from the US to the United Kingdom than it was in 1996. The world economy is fragmented. Okay. Now, since I only have a few minutes to tell you a little bit about this field, what I'm going to do very, very quickly is giving you a set of additional references. Again, and remember, the slides are online, so you can have, and in fact, the slide version is a little bit longer, so you have even more references. A great paper that I really love is Christopher Clayton and his co-author, A Framework for Geoeconomics. They kind of set up a very nice theoretical framework to think about many of these issues. Catherine Moore and Christopher Treves, they have a recent survey on geoeconomics where they kind of outline a lot of the sub-areas of this field. And then you have geoeconomic fragmentation by Ayar and his co-authors at the IMF, where they also talk a lot about these things. So if you're into economics, this will be the first three things I will read. Now, if it happens to be the case that you want to learn more about what people are doing in political science, look, I think that our friends in other social sciences sometimes criticize economics for bad reasons, but sometimes they criticize economics for good reasons. And one of the reasons they criticize us, I think, with some merit, is that sometimes we don't make an effort to at least read what they are doing. So the classic book in some of these ideas from political science is David Baldwin, Economic Statecraft, a book that has been very influential and is used in a lot of graduate programs in the US right now. Is War by Another Means by Blackwell and Harris. And just a few weeks ago, the Oxford Handbook of Geoeconomic and Economic Statecraft came out. All three books are written by political scientists, people in international relations, so you need to understand that that's the way they think about the world. But a few books I have read recently and I really enjoy a lot. Choke Points by Edward Fishman, American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare and How the US Uses These Economic Tools All the Times. Kenneth Rogoff, For Dollar, Your Problem. It makes a point about the importance of the dollar, and The Underground Empire, how American weaponized the world economy. Again, a lot of different books, a lot of different things that can be written. However, before entering into the main substance of what I want to say today, let me point out that we need to be humble. Okay? That a lot of the things we can say in geoeconomics, we need to put them in the perspective of we are in a very complex environment. This is in some sense general equilibrium of general equilibrium because it's the internal general equilibrium of every country, then at the world level, and that often social scientists in general and economists in particular get things fundamentally wrong about the geoeconomy. Abraham Bergson, very famous economist at Harvard, was considered at this time the top expert on the Soviet economy. A little bit of a personal link. I was at Harvard for 1 year and I used his former office. And he wrote this book in the early 1960s, The Real National Income of the Soviet Russia since 1926. Main punchline of the book, the Soviet Union economy is growing so fast that it's going to overtake the United States. And the United States needs to decide whether we want to keep democracy and a market economy or move to central planning but get rid of democracy, because obviously central planning is going to take over the world. Didn't quite work out that way. Famine, 1975, by William and Paul Paddock, American Decision, Who Will Survive? This book argued in the early 1970s that the world population was growing so fast and that the food supply was not growing enough, that by 1975, hundreds of millions of humans will die. And that the only country in the world with a substantial surplus of food by that time will be the US, and that the US need to make a triage decision and decide who will need to survive and who will need to die. And they say the country that needs to die is India. India hasn't really done anything to curb their population growth, so let's write India off. Interesting point, in 2024, I'm actually giving a talk about the demographic evolution of humanity on Monday at the European Reconstruction and Development Bank. India is already below replacement rate since many years ago. The state of Kerala has a lower fertility rate than the United Kingdom, and India in 2024 is a net supplier of food to the rest of the planet. And this one, the Coming War with Japan, 1991, by George Friedman and Meredith Levert, they basically say that the US and Japan were doomed to have a war and that there will be a second Pacific War in the next 20 years because the Japanese economy was going to take over the world. Japanese economy didn't really do so well. Anyway, so let's be careful with what we say, okay? This is not to mock these authors. This is to say we are dealing with very complicated issues and you can get things very fundamentally wrong. Okay, so this was a very, very high-level introduction to many of the ideas of geoeconomics. And you're saying, okay, fine, that looks fantastic as a TED talk, but what is the meat? Give me the real substance. So I'm going to tell you about one paper. It's my paper with Francesco. I don't think it's the best paper in the field, but it's the paper I understand the best because I brought it. Okay, so you need to stick with it. Now, on the other hand, I think it's a paper that illustrates very well why geoeconomics is important, what it can give you interesting insights into the world economy, and in addition to it, where I can use machine learning, because one of the goals in my life is to use machine learning in everything that I can. Okay. I mentioned before already that the Western countries, basically the United States, Canada, Australia, and the European Union, and the United Kingdom, have used repeatedly oil sanctions over the last decade or so to exert political power on other countries. Basically, it has been on Iran, so they stopped their nuclear program. Syria, we actually just lifted those sanctions because the Syrians were the Assad family, were not the people you want to marry into. Venezuela with Chavez and Maduro, and later Russia with the war in Ukraine. Problem is, just because I stop you, or I pretend to stop you from using or doing some type of export, that doesn't imply it's going to happen. Okay? All Western countries spend incredible amount of time and effort stopping the import of cocaine. And I don't know that much about Oxford, but I'm pretty sure that if I put my mind to it, in the next 60 minutes, I will be able to find at a very reasonable price, very high quality cocaine in this campus. Okay? So just because there is a sanction doesn't imply this doesn't happen. Okay. In particular, what has happened is that the sanctions imposed on these countries had led to the development is what is called dark shipping. So what the heck is dark shipping? The International Maritime Organization mandated many years ago that every ship in the world over 300 tons, which is pretty much every single ship of any importance, needs to have this transceiver. This transceiver sends a signal to a satellite with your location, direction, drought, etc., and sends a signal back of where the other ships around you are. Why is this so important? Because you are navigating in the middle of the high sea, it's dark at night in the middle of a storm, the radar is not working very well, you may bump into someone. Okay? So even if this was not mandated, this is a very good idea. If you take any sailing class, at least in the US, the first thing they tell you is get one of those. It's around $700 on Amazon. For a basic unit, top of the line unit, $2,000. So this is very reasonable in price. Okay. Turns out to be the case that this signal is sent to a satellite, and the satellite also sends the signal to a public database. And Francesco and I, with our co-authors, downloaded that database, publicly available. And we look at it, and what you see is the following. You see ships living over there in the south of Nigeria, where there is a lot of oil, and they're sending the signal, and the signal disappears. And then the signal reappears over here. Now, from time to time, these things fail, fine. And they should fail like 0.1% of the times. And what you can see is one oil tanker, another oil tanker, another oil tanker dropping the signal. What is happening? There is illegal smuggling of oil. That tells you that theoretically, we could use this information from the database to figure it out how much oil smuggling is out there. Why do you care? First of all, to know how effective sanctions are. But second, and that goes to the point of what geoeconomics is useful about. Imagine that you are a producer of oil, and I really, really prevent you from producing oil. What do you think is going to happen with the price of oil in the international market? Go up. I'm the Bank of England. That's an inflationary pressure. What should I do? Well, I may want to increase my interest rates to control inflation. But let's suppose that I'm telling him, no, you cannot export oil, but he's illegally exporting it to her. What is going to happen with the international price of oil? Who knows? Maybe go up, maybe go down. Maybe, in fact, may go down because he's selling it cheaper to her because it's illegal oil. But if that's the case, then we don't have an inflationary pressure. We have a deflationary shock. You see how important this is? If you are the governor of the Bank of England, you are keenly interested in knowing what are the consequences of oil sanctions. And as we demonstrate in the paper, the general equilibrium effects of what is going to happen. In particular, what is going to happen is that the Russians cannot export oil anymore to the Western countries, but they can export oil to China. The Chinese are tough negotiators. And the Chinese say, yes, we are going to get your sanctioned oil, but we are going to impose you quite a haircut. We are only going to pay you 80% of the price that should be paid on the market. What happens then? China gets cheaper oil. How does cheaper oil from China translate? Well, in that China can produce goods cheaply. And now you get into the international trade, China is producing more cheaply. The imports that come to the United States are cheaper. Turns out to be the case, you have a deflationary pressure in the US. So surprisingly enough, the optimal policy from the perspective of the US is to impose sanctions on Russia, not because it will stop Russia from exporting, but because in that way, Russia could only export to China. China will be tough negotiators, and a big chunk of that will be passed back to the United States through lower cost of Chinese imports. Unless, of course, you decide that importing cheap goods is a bad idea, as some people think. But you see why you need economics. You need economics because you need to think about bargaining. You need to think about general equilibrium effects. You need to think about unintended consequences. And this is what the economics can contribute to the discussion. Okay? Now, you are thinking, okay, Jesús, how in the world Francesco and Gillian, Ale, and you are going to be able to do this? This sounds immensely complicated. Well, of course, it means immensely complicated. You know, the people who are smuggling oil don't want to tell you. First thing the Russians do when they invade Ukraine, they take out their statistics on oil exports. But the people who are buying oil illegally don't want to tell you either. Maybe the Chinese don't care. You know a country that imports a lot of illegal oil? South Koreans. Everyone thinks that South Koreans are nice, gentle people, Hyundais, nice car. And yet, South Koreans don't ask too many questions about where the oil that arrives to the refineries come. So South Korea doesn't have much interest in disclosing this thing. Now, the dark ships themselves, they are doing something illegal. They don't want to tell you either. Now, in some proprietary data that one could try to use, for instance, we can have satellite imagery. The problem is, even if I have pretty much satellite photographs of any place in the planet on demand, it costs between $10 to $25 per square kilometer. If I go to my dean and I say, they give me $10 million for this research project, even with a different financial environment than the one we live in right now, he's not going to be too keen to give me $10 million. And the other thing we could try to do is, for instance, buy data from SP Global on ownership and insurance data, extremely expensive, and who knows where this data come from. Okay, so this is what we are going to do, and this is super cool. Okay, we are going to go to the AES database, and we are going to download every oil tanker ship trip between 2017 to 2023. Every single one of them. This is not sampling statistics. I'm not going to report the standard errors. This is the population of the world, okay? And the frequency is every 2 seconds. So, if you are worried about how often do I see this observation. Now, this means we will have billions of observations. And yes, in the longer version of this paper, there is quite a bit of discussion about how to do database management when you have billions and billions of observations. Not today, another day. And I have amazing information. The International Maritime Organization number, think about as the license plate, the time stop, the drought, the speed, the heading, the geographical coordinates. And what I'm going to do, we are going to do, is we are going to develop a machine learning algorithm that is going to take facts about the characteristics of the ship and fact about the trip in itself, and is going to determine whether or not this was a trip that involved oil sanction busting. This is what is known as a problem of unsupervised learning. What do I mean by that? Standard problems in machine learning are called supervised. Basically, I do the following. I'm trying to figure it out. Is this a photograph of a cat or a dog? So what I do is the following. I get 10,000 photographs of cats, 10,000 photographs of dogs. I hire 100 undergrads, and I say, is this a cat or a dog? And they label it. And then I use those labels to train a machine learning algorithm. Over here, I cannot do that. So what I need to do is design a system, a machine learning algorithm, that will use some information and being able to figure it out in its own. This is a much more challenging problem from the perspective of computer science. And if I had a little bit of time, I will tell you exactly how we do it, but I can't give you the punchline. We are going to look for things that are interesting. I'm going to look at things like the vessel age. Okay? I'm not telling the machine learning algorithm older oil tankers are more likely to be involved in sanction busting. That will be cheating. I'm only telling the machine learning algorithm, think about the age of the vessel. Is this informative or not? And the machine learning algorithm will decide whether or not this is important and where the sign will be a plus or a minus. Think about the number of vessels owned by a commercial operator. Probably if you're into sanction busting, you try to operate few vessels, not a big corporation. Think about the flag state according to the Paris Memorandum of Understanding list. You are listed in Panama? Maybe this is interesting. And we are going to compute a very interesting average trip suspicion score. Okay, so this is beautiful. This is the type of data that we get. Okay, so we have this ship, traveling in the middle of the sea. This is the wide open sea. Oops. Hundreds of miles to the left, hundreds of miles to the right, and then it goes back, and then it goes back again. Okay, so this is not your small road in the middle of the Cotswolds when there's a car coming in the other direction and then you need to turn to the left, so both of you can happen. This is the middle of the open sea. Or this one, an oil tanker, and then does this like an American tourist lost in a turnabout, coming back. These guys are spoofing the satellite to try to hide something funky. So we are going to look for this type of trips. Now, how are we going to validate this? Are we getting something right or not? Okay, so we are going to look at the following things. We are going to see a ship getting close to a refinery that is sanctioned. And then the signal goes down. And then we forecast from the time where the signal goes down, how long will it take at the regular speed to get to the suspicious spot? And then we see that a little bit later, the signal goes back. So I know where the ship is at that time with a very high accuracy. And then I ask for the photograph from the satellite. I don't have enough money to ask for millions of photographs, but we have enough money to ask for a few thousand photographs. And we name names. This is Roma, that's the Iowa number, on Kark Island in the south of Iran on August 20, 2022, loading oil in an illegal way. We got this right. These guys were not supposed to be at that place at that moment. Okay, sometimes what we see is that there is a ship coming in this direction, a ship coming in this direction, and then suddenly they shut down their signals. And then a little bit later, they separate each other. So we again forecast where they are going to meet. and we look for a photograph. And then you have Abyss and Sanaya Queen on the Persian Gulf on January 28, 2022. So we validate our findings. We know who is cheating. I have a few more examples. The Galaxy on Kark Island, Asuron in Kosmino, Russia, the Panda and the El Caparana in Gibraltar. And by doing this, we are able to actually, let me skip this one, get information about the total amount of oil tankers involved in funky fields, around 555 of them. So around 1/4 of the world fleet is involved into doing these things. And again, going relatively fast, we are able to find not only the amount of oil when this is happening and how it responds to the imposing of sanctions. So this is Venezuela, and each of these dots is places where there are funky transactions going on. The darker the color, the more transactions. There is always a little bit of funky stuff going on in the world. There is always some illegal smuggling. Sometimes it's not because you are doing sanction busting. Sometimes it's just because you are not declaring for tax purposes and things like that. Look what happens after Senator Marco Rubio convinces the US government to impose sanctions on Venezuela. And then in 2019. Russia, each of this is a trip of a tanker. We just put the red line between the beginning and the end of the gap. A few in 2021, not many. There were already some sanctions on Russia, but 2022, 2023, many more. And finally, this is super interesting. Okay, 2021, a lot of illegal transactions in the Persian Gulf, because this is, of course, the Iranian sanctioned oil. You see much fewer in 2022, 2023. Why? Turns out to be the case that the Russians are giving the illegal smugglers a better deal than the Iranians. And there are only that many oil tankers involved in smuggling of sanctions. So the guys who are really losing out of the sanctions on Russia is Iran. This is why the use of machine learning, and this is why thinking about this in terms of machine learning is such a game changer. So we are actually able to find an evolution of the world oil. This blue line is the legally exported oil in by sea. This is the illegally exported oil, and you can see it's a big chunk of it. In some months, it's actually more illegally exported oil than legally exported oil. And we also have a little bit where this oil is coming from and where this oil is going. So where is the Russian oil going? By the way, this is a perfect example of a gravity model that you learn from international economics. Russian oil is going to South Korea, it's going to Egypt, it's going to China. A lot of Iranian oil is going to United Arab Emirates, Malaysia, etc., Syrian oil, and Venezuelan oil. And what we do in the rest of the paper, and I'm not going to present it here because I'm running out of time, is then we put all this data in the context of a general equilibrium model of the oil market in the world. We get some predictions of the model. We use those predictions to identify linear projections and structural vector autoregressions, and we look at the effects of sanctions on objects of interest like interest rates, inflation, output, etc., and we can use those to think about optimal monetary policy responses to this type of oil sanctions. So suddenly, by thinking about this geoeconomic perspective, we can come up with data on oil sanctions, on the general economic effects, and what is important, to tell the Bank of England how they should think about these things. So I hope this was an example of how you can use this very abstract introduction I did at the beginning to actually deliver something that is useful for economics. Now, many of you are thinking, okay, Jesús, you brought that paper. What next? So what I'm going to tell you is ideas for future research. All of those are free for you. If you want to use any of those for a paper, feel free to do it. You don't even need to, well, you need to sign it, but except for that, feel free, no other prize. That's side 5 of my random papers. Okay. I want to tell you that I think it's very important to think about the stochastic dynamics. That is very important to think about political economy. That is very important to think about multipolar wall. And that is very important to think about economy. So I can see over there hundreds of dissertations to be written. Okay. So for instance, what do I mean by stochastic dynamics? One of the things that I think is really at the very core of modern economics is that we care a lot about dynamic choices, today versus tomorrow, and we care about shocks. Most of the models in geoeconomics do not really do much of an effort on both. So think about, for instance, learning by doing. Wonderful book that I always recommend people to read by Chris Miller, Chip War. It's a book about how the US has imposed sanctions on China on semiconductors and chips. But of course, the problem is, if I impose sanctions on China, the Chinese are pretty good at computer science, they may develop their own industry. Okay? So you need to think about this type of effects. And that doesn't imply whether or not you want to do it in one way or another, but you want to think about the option value of when to exert your power. One of my colleagues at Penn, George Maillard, has this great line. Reputation is to be used. Okay? So you have the reputation of being a very trustworthy guy, maybe one day you want to default. So that's the same thing. You may want to be a very reliable partner, but from time to time, you may not want to be. When is that the option thing to do? There are issues of time consistency. I may want to promise you that I'm not going to, for instance, impose a tariff on your exports to me, but then I may change my mind. Very little done about this thing. And then shocks. Okay. So one of the classes I teach at Penn, believe it or not, is economic history of Latin America. Hey, I have the right name. And the point I try to explain over there is that we make a lot of fun of Argentinians. You know, Argentina in 1914 is one of the richest countries in the world, and now it's not. And we always say, Argentinians, they were so stupid, they closed themselves to international trade and went to an import substitution strategy after World War II. But if you think about it, it was not so crazy. So you're Argentina, why are you prosperous in 1914? Because you have basically been exporting meat and grain to the British Empire. But then World War I comes, and that gets completely disrupted. Okay, fine. World War I stops. Then, 1929, again, Great Depression, the British passed the imperial preferences, not a good strategy anymore. And then in 1939, World War II. Basically, the strategy that you have used to develop for 100 years is subject to these constant shocks. Say, I cannot really rely on that. I need to do something different. And maybe import substitution, you know, yes, it violates Ricardian comparative advantage, but it may be the only thing I can do. And guess what? Turns out to be the case that the war never goes into World War III, but what if the Korean War had spin out of control? Douglas MacArthur does something stupid. Maybe we will teach in this class about how super smart the Argentinians were on going on import substitution, while the South Koreans and the Taiwanese went in this absolutely absurd strategy of export orientation. Okay? So, you know, let's try to think about shocks in an important way. By the way, there is a very nice book about Raúl Previs and how he thought about some of these issues. Now, the political economy. One thing that to me is very important and is missing in nearly every paper that I see in economics is the political economy in the interior of the country. Countries are not monoliths. Countries are not just entities that make decisions. Countries are groups of people trying to do things together. And my favorite example is one of my favorite books by Eckhart Kerr. It's The Construction of the High Seas Fleet and Inner Party Politics in Germany. Unfortunately, only a little bit of the book is translated into English, but if you read German, it's a great book. Kerr makes a very fundamental question. If you are the British Empire around 1900, what is the absolute only red line that you are not going to talk about? Your neighbors in the North Sea building a high seas fleet. Okay? Because that puts in danger your whole national security strategy. That's the only thing you cannot let happen. And yet you are Germany, and you decide to do this. For what? What did Germany ever get out of their high seas fleet? Even in World War I, it was pretty useless. In fact, the revolution in November 1918 starts with the sailors of the fleet. Well, what Kerr tries to argue is that the construction of the high seas fleet was not an issue of national security for Germany. It was the consequence of the inner politics in Germany, where Bismarck and, well, not Bismarck, his successors were able to put together a working coalition through the type of bargainings involved in that construction. So when the United States is making right now decisions about tariffs, think about the struggles and the political economy within the United States. Or think about China. The best way to describe the Chinese political system right now is as a mercantilist, Leninist socialist political system. It's Leninist because there is a leading party that is in charge of it, but it's not Marxist anymore, it's mercantilist. They believe in the idea that the path to prosperity and dominion is controlling a lot of key industries. And that has a lot to do with the interior politics of China. So I think that papers that open the door to heterogeneity and think about heterogeneous agents within the country are going to teach us a lot of things. I spent too much of my life solving a heterogeneous agent models. I have even lectured here at Oxford in past years about it. But for instance, something relatively simple that one could do is think about models within each country. There are two agents, like a capitalist of a worker or of a low-income, low-skilled worker, high-skilled worker. A lot of papers that can be written along those dimensions. Multipolar wall. Standard models in geoeconomics have one hegemon. That's silly. The real world has multiple hegemons. You know, that was the base of British foreign policy for centuries, was the balancing of power within different countries in Europe. Sometimes we are with the French against the Spanish. Sometimes we are with the Prussians against the French. And in the world, there are different hegemons, and there is going to be competition among them. And what may happen is that actually the small country is going to be able to extract from the hegemon. The standard model in geoeconomics is that the hegemon extracts from the poor country, or the small country. It may be the case the other way around, because the small country is able to play one hegemon against the other. And that will actually help us to understand one of the big debates in international relations is when you have bandwagoning, everyone piling behind an hegemon or balancing, different countries aligned with different hegemons. This is another discussion that goes to Kinsey Wrights and Kenneth Waltz. If you're interested, this is one of the most classic books, the Theory of International Politics. But the good thing is by building explicit models, I actually think we will be able to say something more about the big debate between balancing and bandwagoning. And finally, let me talk very, very quickly about econometrics because I want to wrap up right now. There's a lot of econometric work that needs to be done. We need to think about what identification means in this type of context. We need to think about what is a structural parameter, what is not a structural parameter. We need to think seriously about uncertainty, about data, and all the data limitations involved in this type of exercises. But let me wrap up because I have 45 seconds left. For good or for bad, the world has changed. The wall of the international liberal order of the 1990s is gone. And we are entering into a world where there is going to be a lot of exertion of power through economic means. And as economists, we need to think about this. Hopefully, to help a little bit for human welfare, but at least some of us actually think that increasing human welfare is good. Not so clear to me that most people agree on that anymore. So I think that economics is a great area to do a lot of interesting research. And at the same time, remember the books I told you that got completely wrong. Let's try to be humble about what we can. Thank you.
Jesus, now I invite our discussant and speaker, Tony Venables, at the floor, and we can have a discussion. But I think I'm here. Okay.
Okay, I'll stand up rather than take the soft seat. Thank you, Jesus. This is not an area that I had read essentially anything on till the last couple of days. So real thanks to Jesus and the department for putting this together to get me doing a bit of reading. So this is 0 slides and a much more general rather than specific level of discussion. And let me try and be quick. Probably fail, but let me try and rattle through. Okay, geoeconomics, new subdiscipline, whatever. How is that going to change the way I think about trade and international issues? Rather more importantly, how is it going to change the way other people think about trade and international economic issues? What's my sort of Well, really what I want to do in these couple of minutes is kind of lay out, I think, sort of my agenda for what the questions are here and what geoeconomics might potentially do to change the way people think. Okay, so what's the sort of list of questions, issues that I'd like to see addressed in this literature? Well, I've got a bit of a list here. I mean, the first one is, yeah, in the time of conflict, how do you use trade to do it? I think we had a bit of that in the specifics here. I push back against that. I mean, yeah, the generals will take over and the techies will do it, but I'm not going to, you know, focus on that at all as what I want in this literature. So what do I want? I want to know how, yeah, I'm maybe going to think about trade differently in terms of to what extent does trade create tensions, create conflict in the world? So that's one of the questions I'd like this to address. A second one, yeah, how is trade used to exercise power, not just in particular conflict, but more broadly? What are the opportunities to exercise power? What are the incentives to exercise power? And importantly, do you exercise power by carrots or sticks? You know, that seems to be absolutely critical. You know, there are ways of buying influence and there are ways of beating people up. I think I know which one I prefer. So creating tension, exercising power, but then also how does trade shape vulnerability? You know, if you do get into conflict situations, how resilient is your economy likely to be in handling that? So those are the sort of big questions. Well, there are three big questions that I'd like the literature to address. But of course, all those build up to the really big question, which is how do we design a world trading system that doesn't create too many tensions and doesn't encourage countries to use sticks and doesn't leave countries too vulnerable to conflict and to trade conflict. So those are the sort of big questions that will be on my agenda for this subject. Let me say a little bit about, you know, how I would go about thinking about them. I mean, the starting point obviously is having a good view of what trade does. How does trade actually work? And how do economists and therefore politicians think about the effects of trade? And how has that changed recently? What has changed in the nature of trade, in the nature of the world, in the nature of politics to have got us into the mess we're in now, right? After a long period where trade was all, you know, growing and wonderful, now it's, as you all know, somewhat problematic. So if we want to understand that, let me construct two different views of trade. One which I think was absolutely the dominant view, you know, through the whole of the post-war period until the last, you know, 15 or 20 years, and one which I think is an important way that the nature of trade has changed in a way that has created conflict and vulnerability and perhaps opportunities for exercising power. So very quickly, you know, the straw man one, you know, trade is wonderful, brings mutual benefits, gains from trade for everyone. We're not going to ask whether they have absolute benefits or relative benefits. We're not going to think very much about internal distribution of income, but mutual benefits from trade. Yeah, a couple of wrinkles in that, you know, there obviously are sort of internal distributional issues. Oh, but we compensate, you know, no, can compensate, no problem. There's obviously the optimal tariff argument, but well, we've got the WTO, which takes care of that. So it's all is rosy, all is perfect. Trade promotes peace. Obviously, you know, that was important in the establishment of the GATT. critical in the establishment of the European Economic Community. Trade is a mechanism for peace. Some empirical evidence supporting that. So trade was not creating tensions, just beautiful mutual benefit world. The exercise of power, well, trade was used as a carrot, wasn't it? Yeah, we wanted European countries to be nice and democratic and things. So if they accepted that, then they could join the European Union. So, carrots being offered rather than sticks being used. Vulnerability, did trade make countries more vulnerable to being bullied or threatened? There's a nice quote from, well, it's almost a quote, sort of slightly distorted quote, in one of the geopolitics papers that I read. So Adam Smith saying that free trade, well, he's not quite saying this, but this is what he's driving at, makes commerce run in a great number of small channels. So you're not vulnerable. It's not, you're not just stuck trading with everything with one partner or whatever. It's running through a great number of small channels. So that's one view of the world. And great. It's a very stylized view I've given you, but was I think the dominant view for a long time. But in addition to that, now I think things about trade have changed. I'm not saying completely superseding that other view, but the world has changed in political ways, but also in fundamental ways that trade operates. The way I'd sort of like to summarize that is that people care more about quantities than they do about prices. Okay, I mean, when did you ever hear a politician say the terms of trade really matter? We've got to pursue the optimal tariff argument. People just don't think that way. Quantities are more salient than prices. When I say quantities, what do I mean? I mean employment. I mean the structure of the economy. What you're producing, what you do is more important than the exact price you get for it. That thinking, I think, is prevalent, and possibly for good reason. Let's think about that thinking. I guess there are two elements to it. Is there some truth to it, and why should we care? The why should we care bit first. Why do we care? Well, we care because we know that trade has left regions left behind. In the UK, the industrialization. In the US, I have not read Steve Bannon myself. I've been talking to someone who has. And Steve Bannon makes very good cases about the American heartland. And obviously, it's not just trade that hit them. There's technical change and all that. But what you do matters. And trade has been one of the factors in causing real problems. That's one reason to care. Vulnerability. As firms have offshored and it's become easier to transmit blueprints around the world and do FDI, have countries become more vulnerable? Well, I think the answer is yes, and we care about it. There was an article in the FT a couple of weeks ago about Europe is about to lose its last factory that produces bulk antibiotics. Do we care about that? Well, I think we probably do. And of course, the chip war, the book that Jesús talked about is really good on this. The world is completely dependent on Taiwan for high-end chips, and Taiwan is completely dependent on one company in Holland for producing the kit that can produce the high-end chips. So, vulnerability is a feature of some modern trade. And why else do we care? Well, externalities of all sorts. We care about R&D, so we want, if R&D is creating positive externalities, we would like sectors that do R&D. And the exact price doesn't matter. We want that activity. There are reasons why they care. Why has this happened? Has it happened? Well, I suppose I would say, wouldn't I? That it's something to do with agglomeration and increasing returns to scale and all that. So a lot of these sectors, activity wants to concentrate in one place or few places. You want to be a place where it happens. It's a bit sort of binary, 0-1. Europe has a car industry or China has a car industry. It's probably not going to be both, right? So if that's the nature of trade, then that's making you very vulnerable. It's changing things. So agglomeration, tipping points, hysteresis, and all that. An industry can unravel gradually and then fast. There's a tipping point. But this hysteresis, you're never going to get it back. The stuff about Apple. Can Apple move its supply chain from China to the US? Absolutely no way. Just once you lose a sector, it's gone. So what am I trying to say here? I care about creating sources of conflict and tension, opportunities for exercising power, and vulnerability of countries. The new features of the trading world, as I knew over the last 20 years or whatever, I think they do create a source of tension. The rise of China is great success of globalization. Hope you don't like it. Face it, lots of areas, countries have suffered. That's a source of tension. Vulnerability, I've talked about, the import dependency. We are more, places are more vulnerable. Exercise of power, well, that's what we're seeing at the moment, right? Countries feel they don't have power, so they do crazy things in an attempt to exercise power, moving themselves, right to the edge or beyond, what is acceptable under the WTO rules. And that's not just Trump. I mean, obviously Trump won, and Biden, and potentially protectionist industrial policy in a lot of countries. So these tensions in the world have created a geoeconomics that has taken us to the edge or out of existing trade rules. So the real agenda for me on geoeconomics is how to design a set of trade rules, a trading system that doesn't create tension or vulnerability or incentives to use sticks in exercising power. Okay.
Thank you, Tony. So thank you. I don't know, Jesus, if you want to reply quickly to this point.
No. I mean, I agree everything that Tony has to say. I didn't want to say before because I didn't want to bias you, but I spent so much time reading your 2001 book with Paul Krugman, and I was so nervous. You were going to find a fundamental flaw in my reasoning, but I agree with everything.
Well, I'm sorry it took you so long to read it.
I'm very bad. I have a very low, I'm a low DFP person.
Okay, so then before I ask the floor for more questions, let me ask you one question. That in the latest years, geoeconomics had always a negative, somewhat negative connotation, where one country will extract power, negative power on other countries to extract some profits out of it. But history, that was not always the case in history. If I go back, for instance, in 1948, there was this Marshall Plan in the US, and that was really accepting a geopolitical concept that unified Europe. So the US was providing a lot of help to Europe after the Second World War, but that actually was good for the US to have influence for the British dominant currency, but also for Europe. So my question is, why in these latest episodes are different, and what maybe can we learn from history that can actually enable us to achieve a positive impact of the geopolitical pressures?
So first of all, I fully agree with your point that geoeconomic power can be used for the good of everyone. So when in my global economic history class, when I teach the Marshall Plan, I have this advertisement for the Marshall Plan that someone in the US government put together. And it's a beautiful, because it's a windmill, and every of the kind of parts of the windmill is a European flag. And then, you know, the windmills have this thing at the back that kind of directed is the US flag. And I thought that that can make the point very nicely. You know, we are all together, but there is one kind of steering in the right direction. And certainly the Marshall Plan went in the right direction. I think that unfortunately, and this is actually work that I'm trying to explore right now with Luis Garicano at London School of Economics and with Tano Santos at Columbia Business School, is that the world has transitioned into this mentality of zero sum. So the 1980s, 1970s, we were very optimistic about what was going to happen with the world. We thought that cooperation was good, that trade, interrelations, economic growth in general generates positive sums. And in that way, we were much more willing to engage in cooperation. For many reasons, and maybe this will be a different lecture, I think that we have transitioned into a very zero-sum view of the world. I think that's exactly the view of Trump. What I gain is what you lose, and what you gain is what I lose. And when you are thinking about the world from that perspective, then it's clear that you want to use geoeconomics to steal money from you, because, you know, if every industry that you gain is an industry that I lose, then yes, I don't want that to happen. Now, of course, I'm totally against this zero-sum mentality, and I think it's as a citizen or a engaged economist, if you want to use that point, is one of the things I really, really want to struggle very hard against. The world is not zero-sum. The world is a positive sum. But if you think about the world as a zero-sum, then the temptation of using geoeconomics in this way is very big.
But sorry if I come in. I mean, I think the point I'd want to make is, unfortunately, the world is closer to zero sum.
Yeah, okay, maybe. Yes.
Because of this business, you know, you have the industry or I have the industry.
Yeah.
And that's clearly it's not entirely zero sum. There are positive gains in the aggregate. But if the technology has changed such that that binary thing is going on, then that's a problem, right?
No, that's fair enough. And I'm willing
which geoeconomics should solve.
Yeah, no, but and I agree that in a world of enormous increase in regards to scale, some of the old ideas need to change. And that I give you the point. But I think this is just not about industries, you versus industries, me. I think that even within countries, people have much more of an idea that if region A gets something, it's because region B gets something less.
Then what about this concept of global economic integration? If we are really integrated, then we don't have this concept. If we are polarized, then obviously what you don't get, I get. But if I depend, if my production, if I depend on your input, I would expect that probably this is a systematic lack of global integration that is fostering.
So you can think about this as from a positive perspective and from a normative perspective. From a positive perspective, it may be the case that, also building on what you were suggesting, maybe we are moving into a world where actually global integration is not that important. Okay? So think about, for instance, automatization. Or think about the fact that my favorite example is actually not automatization, it's energy. Okay? So the oil industry, the oil era of the world is a world where energy production is concentrated in very few places that export to the rest of the world. The renewable world is a world where most electricity is produced locally. So suddenly you don't have an international energy market. So it's a different ball game. So suddenly you don't care that much about globalization because you don't depend on the energy that are imported from outside. So that's a game changer. From the normative perspective, there is the issue, and I think that Tony is absolutely right about it, that sometimes we have been a little bit naive about what people care about. Maybe sometimes people care a little bit more about having a job than having an income. And I actually have made that point in other contexts, that just going to someone and saying, there you have like, £2,000 a month is not what they want. What they want is a job, even if that job only gives them £1,500 a month. And I think that as economists, we have missed that point a few times from the normative perspective. I'm not talking about from the positive perspective.
Let me take a few round of questions.
Can I try and step back and make a conceptual point? I'm very interested to try and understand what geoeconomics might actually mean conceptually. And there's a, we've been here before earlier this week when we had a whole wonderful seminar about fairness. And it was largely about trying to deconstruct what that, or rather open out what that word meant. And I sat here wondering, and here's my idea, and there's a bit of personal history, narrative history in this. There was a period of time when I was the Adam Smith Professor of Political Economy in Glasgow, and it was a professorship of political economy, not economics, and rationalization, the current holder of the chair. They've changed the name. It's now the Adam Smith Professor of Economics in the Economics Department, proper silo stuff. And so I was taught and learned and read about the Adam Smith problem, invented by German scholars in the 19th century, which is basically, which is the stuff that should be analyzed using the equipment of the theory of moral sentiments about communities living together and interacting in ways which, if you like, political scientists and sociologists would study, and which bits should be analyzed in the way that economists analyze things. And Smith began by saying, I can do this. What I'm going to do is identify the simple case of perfect, it took us 150 years to formalize this, perfect markets with perfect information, perfect competition, supply curve, demand curve, analyze this. And our methods are those of incentives and our of studying, and our issues of interaction between individuals in this, what's going on, are prices. His was Tony identified. How interested are we in prices or not? Economists central because they're the incentive mechanism. And then very 20th century, the economist becomes terribly self-confident and tries to invade everywhere else. So, and the crucial bit of invasion of the business world is Jensen, Mecklin, and the principal agent problem. You can understand firms by setting out all the incentive structures. And then Gary Becker said, well, I can do families that way too. And so we have a theory of, I think it's helpful to think of a big problem called how well do we live, and we're all in the end, with push comes to shove it, utilitarians, and we're trying to maximize something. And we split up how we think of it. And the splitting, I think it's done the way we've done it. With that, I edited an issue of Oxford Review of Economic Policy a couple of years ago and I did this because my colleagues I said, I'm fed up with sitting next Oxford interdisciplinary place to a political economist who burble on with these words like neoliberalism and modernism and all sorts of political economy words that I couldn't make any sense of. And I said, will you let me lock these political scientists up in a room and not let them out until they talk about the stuff that we discuss? And so they ended up talking about all the economic policy problems that we analyze. And here's the point I'm making. In order to understand the international economics that I've done and taught and worked on, here's the slogan: the politics matters also stupid. that's to say what these political scientists said to us was you need to understand our stuff in order to do your economics properly. And that takes you right back to the Adam Smith problem. You really need to read and understand and think about the theory of moral sentiments before you can do the economics. Because it asks you in the study of the corporate world, is the Jensen-Mecklin way of thinking about a corporation the right way? Or is there some other way? In this, is what we teach, so I'm just re-asking your question, is what we teach in our trade theory courses enough, or do we need more stuff? And in a sense, geoeconomics is the label for more stuff. Isn't that fair?
No, it's totally fair. And I, in my slides, I went out of my way to cite. You saw a lot of photographs of books in history.
Yeah.
Some photographs of book on political science. I didn't cite anything in philosophy or moral sentiments. I couldn't agree with you more. Look, let me give you just an anecdote. I don't know if this is illustrative or not, but a few years I got an outside offer, and my dean asked me what do I wanted to stay at Penn. And one of the things I asked was that the department will hire a lecturer to teach an undergraduate course in philosophy and economics.
Yeah.
Because I thought this is an elective that my department offers. And I thought that, look, if you are an undergraduate economic major at Penn, if you don't want to take that class, I'm not going to force you. But I think that completing an undergraduate education in economics and never having been engaged, as you say, with Adam Smith, with John Rawls, with Amartya Sen, was a disfavor. It was something that I did not want to be in a department that didn't do that. Class. So in that sense, I couldn't agree anymore with you. And I love that you cite Adam Smith. I'm going to take this even further. If you really want to understand geoeconomics, the best book is The Peloponnesian War by Tony Venables. Everything you need to know about geoeconomics is over there. And of course, I think it's the book 5, but maybe not. I'm just quoting from memory. The Melian dialogue, when the Athenians get to the island of Melos and they say, the powerful do what they must. And no, the powerful do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. I'm translating from Greek into English, which is always difficult for me. And yes, we should read Thucydides. So I fully agree with you.
Okay, let me open the floor to questions now, and then we can go through that. Yeah, I see a couple. We can take a couple and then another couple. Yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. That was fascinating. I'm a PhD student in economic geography, and I also work as an analyst at the World Trade Organization, WTO. So my question is quite specific and quite straightforward. When it comes to geoeconomics, how do you think the WTO should respond to the growing use of trade tools when it comes to geoeconomics and the current situations? And I suppose WTO should be the main body when it comes to global trade governance. And given the current situation, my question is really straightforward. How do you think, I would love to hear from you, how do you think WTO should or could respond to what's happening right now? Thank you.
I take another, and then Tony, and then Jesús. Daniel.
So I was just wondering, because when you show this graph, when the oil from Russia is going indirectly through South Korea and other importers to the whole world, I was wondering how we should think about the role of multinationals, commodity traders, and regulation overall to think about it. Because that means that for a ship to go from Russia to South Korea implies that there is a company behind the scenes like Glencore or Trafigura cleaning the market, right? So I wanted to know, and these offices are usually in friendly countries like Switzerland, things like this. So I wanted to understand for these companies that have offices in Switzerland and London and so on, how should, not just central banks setting monetary policy, but how should the Western democracies think about regulating them?
Tony, want to go? Tony, you want to go?
That's a really difficult one. And how should the WTO respond? Well, first, I think it's not how the institution responds, it's how the members respond. So Well, let me do this in several stages. One line on that is just, well, if we want a rules-based system, then the members of the WTO had better follow the rules. That's kind of necessary, if not sufficient. Okay, that might be excluding one or more members, the obvious one, having broken the rules. But then I do think, there are different people have come up with different scenarios for, whether it's going to be chaos or sort of, some war game between blocks or sort of slow decay of the rules. And I think there are inherent tensions, the sorts of things that we've been talking about. Some things looking zero sum, countries caring a lot about. It's not just about tariffs. It's a bigger picture. So I would like to see some rethinking of the WTO, of the rules that the system operates under. No, so I'd like to see some rethinking. Well, what? This is where it gets incredibly difficult. What are the most important elements? MFN? Maybe not. I mean, it's a good simplifying force, but the fundamental logic isn't that compelling to me, fundamental reasons. Binding tariffs, reciprocated reductions, and promise keeping. Binding tariffs. So economies work internally as well as internationally if contracts are honored, if uncertainty is reduced, right? So the sort of, following the rules, having binding tariffs, that seems absolutely fundamental. Making sure a path is open for developing countries to follow a China-type strategy, which is incredibly problematic because of the sort of zero-sum issues we've been talking about. They're grabbing all our industries. Let's have industrial policy. Yes, I actually read the Draghi report yesterday in thinking about this. Everybody will want to do that. That's right, they'll want to do that. But you have to keep the path open for developing countries to move into sectors that have been the preserve of OECD countries. So the tensions here are horrible, but sort of trying to set out what the fundamental things to be, the priority of really important things for the trade system to maintain. And then, if you think of the structure, that would be good. That's a long-term project. The short-run one is just to stop things degenerating to chaos more than they have over the next months or years.
Jesus?
Okay, so there is an episode of, I don't remember, it's just minister or just prime minister, one of the two, where Sir Humphrey Appleby is talking with Sir Richard Wharton, and they are describing what they call the syllogism of the politician, which is premise, something needs to be done. This is something that can be done, hence we should do this. And I think that has often been the case with things like sanctions. Governments, the Western world, didn't like what Iran was doing, didn't really like what Russia was doing, and they thought that sanctions could be a good way to pretend we were doing something, but we didn't really want to live with the consequences, because the consequences was higher energy prices. So it is baked in the game that these sanctions are designed to be broken. And in that sense, probably is not a good reflection of the state of our democratic system, but if we try to enforce the sanctions, I don't think that voters will actually be very happy, and that cannot work out that well either way. Now, I agree with you that if we are going to impose sanctions, it's better to be serious about it than not to be serious about it.
Okay, let's take another round of questions. I see here and there.
First, thank you very much to the professors for the presentation. I have two questions for Professor Jesus, based on the project that you're working on here presented. Firstly, were there any prerequisites or pre characteristics of states that we saw that are most involved in smuggling over the period, or that saw the most increases or highest increase in smuggling, so like period to like their legal systems or their extent of trade integration already in the region? Aside, obviously sanctions would be the biggest step, or were there any other characteristics that affected that? And secondly, I wanted to ask what you thought the implications of the study meant for the impact of sanctions on these countries. Because if you believe in sanctions as almost a corrective tool to some extent for countries that we either think are not benefiting the global order, or that are, in some cases, not doing well in their own countries, it seems that from your study, it shows that criminality through the smuggling are going to increase when sanctions are implemented. You mentioned southern Nigeria and how smuggling increased there, and I think of Biafra in southern Nigeria, which we know has been one of the most violent areas in the world and seen some of the most chaos in the last 50, 60 years, and how political and social instability can be increasing by the introduction of smuggling groups and entities as a result of increased sanctions. So whether you thought by this analysis, maybe sanctions have to be rethought on the way they actually affect the people of the countries, particularly the most vulnerable people of these countries.
So I fully agree. So let me start from the later part of the question. So we basically focus on countries that have been officially sanctioned, just because we have an identification. We know when they were sanctioned and when they were happening. You are absolutely right that a lot of the smuggling is not related with sanction, but it's, for instance, employees and national oil companies stealing money from their own company and smuggling it out for private gains. So that could be another exercise, another extension we could do of the paper. We haven't done that, something that, we can come back to that in the future. There is the richness of the data set is really quite amazing. And, given that I basically do machine learning for a living, the fact that now we have all these machine learning tools really opens the door to analyze data in ways that even 10 years ago would have been impossible. With respect to the first point or the more general conclusion that you have, I fully agree with you. I think that there is some strange, read the book I was mentioning, The Economic Weapon by Nicholas Lambert. I think that we have this very naive view that sanctions work. And usually when we are sanctioning someone, it's usually the type of person who doesn't really care about being sanctioned. And as you say, I think that the historical record over the last 200 years is that sanctions have a lot of unintended consequences that it's not clear we are getting much out of them. So read the book. It's very, very well written. It's a book I strongly recommend
Maybe there are some other questions, but in the meanwhile, I asked her if she can bring me the computer to see whether there are any questions.
Lots of compliments.
Okay.
Questions.
Okay, then let's take.
I like compliments.
Yeah, yeah. Steve, and then we have.
I was just wondering about the relationship to violence. Violence wasn't the word that you mentioned. I've been editing a book with Mark Harrison on economic warfare and sanctions over the last 300 years. The conclusion we came to really was you really have to either combine economic warfare measures with violence, or if it's sanctions, if they're going to work, then you have to have a credible threat of violence. And if you don't, it's not going to work. I think leaving violence out is strange to me.
No,
threat of violence, at least.
I fully agree. In fact, I presented the shorter version of the slides. Online, I have the longer version. And over there, I talk a little bit more about violence, and I talk a lot about the economics of war. And in fact, again, when I teach a little bit of economics of World War II, and I use, of course, some of your stuff with Mark all the time. And over there, I precisely try to think about how geoeconomics, I know this sounds a bit harsh, but how geoeconomics may help to design the highest total factor productivity violence function that one can produce. And if that sounds terrible, but if you are fighting against the bad guys, Germany in 1939, that's something you want. You want to think carefully about that and the integration of violence. And for instance, something I have been telling some of my my graduate students, it was in one of the slides, but I went very, very quickly over it. is trying to think about military production technology and how could we estimate military production technologies, because those are important. If I'm going to fight, let's think about the following scenario. If there is a war between China and the United States on the next 10 years, how efficient are these two armed forces going to be? We don't really know. And we may be in a situation where different agents have different set of beliefs about how effective their armed forces are, and that may lead them to making the wrong decision. I mean, that was actually what happened with Germany in the summer of 1941. They thought they have such a superior military technology at the Soviet Union that they could go for that stupid gamble of Barbarossa. So, yeah, I fully agree with that.
Okay, let me take one last question. Maybe if you can be brief, both of you, and
question is, how do you think in this geoeconomic framework we should think about normative questions? Because if we think about macroeconomics until now, you have this frictionless world where the planner tries to reach a first best allocation and then uses some policy tool to get as close to it as possible given those frictions. And this is obviously trying to maximize utility. Mm-hmm. Now, if you include geopolitics and let's say trying to reduce your dependence on foreign powers and so on, do you think that should go into the planner's problem? Or should we ditch this completely and just think of those kind of geopolitical shock as this exogenous shocks that the planner deals with? Yeah.
Okay. Let's also take the second question, so then we can round up. Yeah.
Yes. So first of all, I want to say I really enjoyed the talk, and I enjoyed the discussion afterwards. I found it very interesting. So my question is about the train of thought you presented in the first half of the seminar, when you were saying, or when you proposed the idea that, for example, take the United States placing sanctions on Russia. Russia then, through the start shipping, will sell their oil to China, and then cheaper goods will then be sold back to the United States. So when you think of this, it seems implicitly like this is a good thing in a sense that, for example, Russia wants to sell their oil, and China gets cheaper oil, and then the United States gets cheaper goods in return, assuming that's what they want to import. So I just wanted to ask, in your opinion, to what extent is this a problem that, for example, countries would even want to solve in the first place, and how would they go about doing that if they want to?
Okay, so let me start with the second question, and then I'll go back to the first. The second, I get asked this question often, and my answer is, look, Francesco and I, we are two poor dudes, two poor lads. We are able to find out all these ships.
Yeah.
Do I think that the intelligence community of the United States, with the billions of dollars at their disposal, cannot do the same thing? Of course they can. So if these ships are still trading, it's because, as you say, it's in the best interest of the current administration in the United States. I'll not even say it's in the current interest, in the best interest of the United States as a whole or the world. But yes, so in that sense, this paper helped me. I was mentioning before Luis Garicano, and Luis, he was very, very committed to the defense of Ukraine. He's still very committed to the defense of Ukraine. And he was keep telling me, why does the United States don't enforce these sanctions more forcefully? Why they keep saying it and then they don't do it? After I brought this paper, I brought to him and say, Luis, because it's actually not in their best interest. Okay, now what you say and what you do is actually very different. So I fully agree with you. And I think this is why geoeconomics really helps you to understand the difference between what they say in the press conference and what they actually do when to talk to the journalists close. To your point, since we are at Oxford, let me close by citing Derek Parfait, one of the greatest moral philosophers of this last 100 years. When I teach my first year graduate course in macroeconomics, I always spend half an hour. Students probably hate it, but it's good for them, going over some of the basic arguments of Parfait in Reasons and Persons, and try to delete from their little brains the idea that utilitarianism is an easy answer to everything, because it's not. Yes, we need to take a stance in our models about what is the utility function and what is the goal, but that's actually, I think, one of the big dark secrets of economics. And going back to Tony's, I think that comments many, many times, the utility functions that we put for social planners or for policy making are not really the utility functions that people really care about, or what they should really care about if you want to get into normative. So I'm more than happy for people to think about different frameworks. Jim Heckman, a good friend, just circulated a paper trying to think about different types of utility functions that, for instance, highlight virtues and virtue ethics. So that's actually something that is, I think, an open door for much research in economics.
Two comments maybe. I mean, do the general equilibrium.
Yes,
that's one. And then to think of the design of the system, the institutional system within which that general equilibrium is being established.
I think with that, we close here. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for coming. And thank you to the speakers.